aftermath of the Civil War, our nation was not divided into the Union and Confederates, it was divided into North and South. The North and the South were divided because of their opposite views on culture, government, society, geography, and economics. How to unite again the North and the South was a question that challenged in Washington, D.C.
Well, there were 3 parts to this issue. 1. How to readmit the Southern states. 2. What to do with the freemen. And 3. How to punish the South.
There were many different plans proposed. Lincoln's plan, Johnson's plan, the Wade-Davis Act, and the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Lincoln's desire had been to restore civil government throughout the broken South as quickly as possible. In 1863, he proclaimed that each formerly rebellious state could reestablish its own government when it met 2 conditions. First, 10% of its citizens who had voted in 1860 had to swear an oath to faithfully support and defend the Constitution of the United States in order to be pardoned. Lincoln withheld pardons on many judges and leaders who supported the rebellion, effectively cutting them off from political power. Secondly, the state had to abolish slavery. When these 2 conditions were met, the national government would let the state government be restored back into the Union. Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, before his plan could fully be carried through. According to World Book Encyclopedias, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln's presidency after his death, created a plan very similar to Lincoln's. It offered pardons to many Southerners except the main Confederate leaders and defenders. In Johnson's plan, the defeated state governments could hold conventions and reform. He required these governments to abolish slavery and ratify the 13th Amendment. By winter 1865, all the former Confederate states except Texas had met Johnson's conditions and wanted to send their representatives to the Capitol, but were not let back in by Congress.
Many radical Republicans in Congress believed that these plans were too moderate and lenient. They insisted that Congress, not the President, be responsible in how to deal with the South. In 1864, the radical Republicans pushed the Wade-Davis bill. It was a much harsher plan requiring a majority of white males, not just 10% swear allegiance, before a state could reestablish its government. It also ordered that anyone who wanted to vote or take part in government swear to never have supported the Confederacy. Finally, the state government not only had to abolish slavery, but repay Confederate debts and its act of secession. The president vetoed this bill, but it was still supported throughout Congress.
The reorganized states may have ratified the 13th Amendment or abolished slavery. However, that did mean they wanted to give all equal rights to new freed slaves called freedmen. Many of the newly reorganized white-ran governments were quick to include black codes or laws that restricted freedmen's equal rights. These consisted of fines or jail time for unemployment, land restrictions, limits on women's rights, and labor contracts where freedmen had to sign an agreement at the start of a year and were not paid until a full year of work was complete. They were not paid at all if a slave quit any time before a year had transpired. Oftentimes, plantation owners were cruel to their slaves, making them do impossible tasks in later stages of the year to force them to quit, and thus freedmen would be in violation of their contract and were not paid.
In response to this, in March 1865, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to help recent freedmen make new lives. The Bureau offered funds for food, medicine, and education, and protection in labor contracts, as well as local troubles. But a freedman's life still remained desperate. The Freedmen's Bureau did not have strong Congress backing, and the organization largely broke apart in 1869. Punishment was not really the idea of Reconstruction. As a response to the lack of progress in Johnson's plan, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, or a series of stricter laws that called for reform rather than serious punishment. The Reconstruction Act required the South to be under military rule governed by a Northern general, required the South to hold election for delegates, to create new state constitutions, required all states to allow qualified male voters, including African Americans, to vote in these elections. It also temporarily barred Southerners that supported the Confederacy from voting and required Southern states to promise equal rights to all its citizens. Lastly, it required the states to ratify the 14th Amendment. The presidents and the moderates didn't think it should be too difficult for the defeated states to rejoin the Union. They wished to forgive and forget. In contrast, the radicals or Congress thought the South should be punished and believed the Civil War was entirely the Confederates' fault. Moderates and the radicals both opposed Johnson's Reconstruction plan and were against the Southerners' use of black codes. However, the radicals were more interested in granting African Americans civil rights and equal treatment. Moderates did not feel it was right to make stricter laws on racial inequalities in the South than there were in the North. In April 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act that declared freedmen were U.S. citizens entitled to full and equal benefit of the laws. Johnson vetoed this act, stating it was unconstitutional and granted the federal government power at the expense of the states. Congress, however, overrode this veto, but fearing that the Supreme Court might agree with the president, having to do with checks and balances, proposed the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenships to the blacks. Johnson did not like the 14th Amendment and encouraged southern states not to ratify it. After this, Congress divided tremendously and did not support Johnson in his control over the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction now was in the hands of Congress.
By 1871, all the Confederate states had reorganized their governments and had been readmitted into the Union. Also, thanks to the newly passed 15th Amendment, blacks now had the right to vote. Economic conditions were desperate. Plantation owners lost $3 billion in slave labor and had trouble gaining labor resources as it grew more and more scarce. It was obvious that the South wanted to maintain the whites' superiority over blacks, with secret organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia were formed to keep blacks and white Republicans intimidated and away from elections. In response, Congress passed the Force Act in 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, saying that federal troops could be used against them.
State governments established taxes that supported school systems. States took over school systems established by the Freedmen's Bureau and built many more. Agriculture, the basis of South's economy, before the war, recovered very slowly. Also, labor resources were becoming more and more scarce. A small attempt was made by state governments to industrialize the South by adding railroads and industry. However, the South's natural resources, due to its geography, were utilized more, continuing to farm. The Reconstruction allowed blacks to participate more in society. It also allowed them to vote and hold political office.
Some successes of the Reconstruction included: 1. Republicans carried out their two main goals, to rebuild the Union and to help repair the war-torn South. 2. Reconstruction stimulated economic growth in the South and created new wealth in the North. 3. The 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteed African Americans the right of citizenship, equal protection under the law, and suffrage. African Americans gained the right to testify in court and to sit on juries. 4. The Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations helped many black families obtain housing, jobs, and schooling. 5. Southern states adopted the system of tax-supported mandatory education practiced in the North. Increased access to education would benefit whites and blacks alike.
In the mid-1870s, people grew weary of new policies and reform due to the Reconstruction. The Reconstruction put the South in major debt and came to symbolize corruption, greed, and poor government. In the South, whites were able to regain control of state governments when federal troops left, and in the North, voters never fully supported the radicals' goal of racial equality. In 1872, all the former Confederates had earned their pardons and started a new form of Democratic voters known as the Solid South. They were opposite of the radical Republicans. In 1877, a compromise was made between Democrats and Republicans regarding the presidential election of 1876. This compromise opened the way for Democrats to regain control of Southern politics and marked the end of the Reconstruction.
Thank you, Reconstruction.
Hit, put it, baby. This is hit, put it, baby. This hit, put it, baby. Done messed around and fell in love. You know you called.